Picture a 2-year-old child. He's just sitting on the floor of a modest home, perfectly quiet, almost like he's settled into this deep, focused meditation.
Which is already pretty unusual for a toddler, honestly.
Right, exactly. And then suddenly he begins to chant aloud. But this isn't, the chaotic, random babble of a toddler imitating the television.
No, it's highly structured.
Yeah, it's this distinctly rhythmic recitation in an ancient language. A language he has never been taught, and one that no one in his immediate family even understands.
It is a really profound image, but also, genuinely baffling from a psychological perspective. You hear this tiny, undeveloped voice, but it's carrying a phonetic weight and an ancient structure that just seems, entirely impossible for someone who has barely figured out how to walk, let alone read.
Welcome to Awaken Daily Life, produced by the International Agama Zen Practice Center. This is a space where we explore meditation, mindfulness, and Buddhist wisdom for everyday living.
And today's deep dive focuses on a really remarkable documented story.
Yeah, the story of a boy in Sri Lanka named Dhammaruwan. We're going to be looking closely at the meticulous research done on this case by Bhikkhu Anālayo. But I want to set a very specific, reflective tone right out of the gate for you listening.
Right, we're not just gawking at a miracle here.
Exactly. We are not treating this simply as some sensational miracle story. Instead, we're cautiously exploring what this incredibly unique phenomenon might actually tell us about the human mind, the mechanics of memory, the ancient oral transmission of early teachings, and ultimately how our daily mental habits shape exactly who we become. Okay, let's unpack this.
We really need to ground this in time and space first.
Yeah.
So the story starts in Pāli, Sri Lanka, in November of 1968, which is when Dhammaruwan was born.
Yeah.
By the time he was around 2 years old, this spontaneous chanting phenomenon began. Now, his mother reacted exactly the way any parent would. She understandably thought it was just, weird toddler babble.
Maybe even a sign of a developmental quirk or something.
Exactly. She actually tried to get him to stop at first, but eventually people in the broader community who had some background in Buddhist texts overheard the boy, and they realized this child wasn't babbling nonsense syllables. He was precisely chanting Pāli Suttas.
And as you listening probably know, Pāli is the ancient language of the early Buddhist texts. He wasn't just reciting a casual prayer either. People specifically recognized the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta.
Which is huge.
Yeah. It is. And as he grew a bit older, he was raised by his foster parents, Bertie and Rosa Seneviratne, over in Kandy. Bertie actually had the remarkable foresight to start recording the boy's chanting on tape.
Thank goodness he did. Because of those specific recordings, the child was eventually visited by some real heavy hitters in the world of Buddhist scholarship and cognitive research.
Right. Prominent monks like Bhikkhu Bodhi, researchers like Ian Stevenson, and later Bhikkhu Anālayo. But there is a really crucial personality detail here that we have to mention. Dhammaruwan was exceptionally shy.
Yeah, he was quite frightened of large crowds.
He really was.
That is a vital piece of context when we look at behavioral motivation. I mean, this wasn't a parley trick engineered by stage parents, and he wasn't like a child prodigy seeking attention.
Right, he hated the spotlight.
He was actually quite distressed by the visitors it brought him. He chanted because he felt this internal compulsion to do so, not for a reward.
But, okay, I have to play the skeptic right now because my mind immediately goes to the most obvious biological explanation. We know a toddler's brain is basically just a highly plastic pattern recognition engine, right?
Oh, absolutely. They mimic whatever they hear.
Right. So couldn't he have simply, absorbed these chants from a local temple broadcast playing on the radio down the street, like a toddler perfectly singing the melody of a pop song they heard in the car, without actually knowing what the words mean?
It is absolutely the most logical first question, and it's exactly what researchers initially assumed. But what's fascinating here is the structural nature of what he was chanting, and specifically how he was chanting it.
Okay, how so?
Well, according to Anālayo's acoustic analysis, the boy's chanting style was entirely alien to your modern Sri Lankan customs.
Alien in what way, though? Like, just the sound of it?
Well, think about how communal chanting happens in Sri Lanka today. As centuries passed and the sheer volume of preserved text grew massive, monks naturally had to speed up the recitation just to, get through the material.
Makes sense.
So modern chanting is typically very rapid, very continuous. It's this unbroken stream of sound where one monk breathes while another keeps the momentum going. But Dhammaruwan's chanting wasn't like that at all.
Right.
No, his pacing was much slower, far more melodic, and he naturally inserted these long, deliberate pauses for breath in a very specific meditative rhythm.
Wait, so you're saying a 2-year-old was intentionally inserting structural breath-on pauses that literally no adult around him was doing?
Exactly.
That doesn't sound like environmental mimicry. That sounds like a distinct, learned technique from a totally different era.
Yeah.
But how did researchers rule out that he didn't just hear, I don't know, an old, weird tape recording once?
Because the textual evidence goes far deeper than just the musical rhythm. Dhammar were enchanted variants of the text and made highly specific structural errors that do not match any existing printed edition of the Pāli texts in the world.
Wow. Not even the academic ones.
Nope. Not the academic Pāli Text Society editions, and certainly not the local Sri Lankan editions he might have theoretically overheard.
Give me an example of these errors. Like, what kind of mistakes are we talking about?
For instance, he would occasionally drop whole chunks of text in a way that is highly characteristic of ancient oral recitation glitches, like skipping from one repeated phrase to an identical phrase a paragraph down.
Oh, like when your eyes skip a line on a page but for audio.
Exactly. But even more telling, in one instance, when reciting a list of divas, celestial beings, he included entire subclasses of divas that simply do not exist in the modern printed versions. They were archaic categorizations.
Meaning, if he was just mimicking a local radio broadcast or a book someone was reading at a temple, those unique, archaic subclasses wouldn't be there at all. And this specific structural omissions wouldn't make any sense.
Precisely. You cannot mimic a sound that doesn't exist in your environment. Researchers categorize this phenomenon as recitative xenoglossy.
Xenoglossy.
Yeah, which is the ability to recite a language that, to all outward scientific appearances, the person has never learned, has never been exposed to, and does not conceptually understand.
So if he didn't absorb this from his environment, we are left with basically a biological or historical impossibility. And when researchers finally asked the boy where he learned these words, his answer opened an entirely different door.
It really did.
When he was old enough to articulate his internal experience, he reported distinct memories of a previous life.
And, we must tread carefully here, using phrases like reportedly and the story suggests, because we are dealing with subjective memory.
Right, which is completely impossible to empirically verify in a lab.
Exactly. But according to his recollection, Dhammaruwan remembered being born into a Brahmin family in ancient India. And this is a massive detail because the Brahmin class was culturally defined by their rigorous, lifelong, generational training in the exact oral memorization of sacred texts.
So his brain, in this reported past life, was fundamentally wired and conditioned for massive, precise textual recall, literally from birth.
Yes. The story goes that he converted to Buddhism, became a monk, and specifically trained as a bhakka.
A bhakka.
Yeah. Now, in the ancient Buddhist world, centuries before writing was commonly used to record sacred texts, a bhakka was a professional reciter. Their entire vocation, their entire monastic life, was dedicated to preserving the teachings by committing them flawlessly to memory.
It's an incredible level of dedication.
It is. And crucially, Dhammaruwan recalled traveling from India to the Mahavihara, the great monastery in Anuradhapura, Sri Lanka. And he remembered making this monumental journey alongside a very specific monk, the famous scholar Buddhaghosa.
Buddhaghosa is basically a titan of the 5th century. I mean, he's the guy who wrote the Visuddhimagga, which is essentially the ultimate ancient encyclopedia of Buddhist meditation and commentary.
Oh, absolutely.
And traditional history actually tells us that Buddhaghosa was, in fact, born a Brahmin in India before converting and traveling to Sri Lanka to translate texts. So while this story absolutely doesn't strictly prove rebirth, the historical echoes are incredibly coherent.
Yeah, we can cautiously say that the timeline, the geographical movements, and the cultural mechanics of his memory align perfectly with accepted historical reality. The ancient world relied completely on these bhikkhas to serve as living, breathing libraries.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because it wasn't just the rote phonetic words he remembered. It was the unspoken context, the tacit emotional knowledge of that ancient monastic world.
Yes, the inside jokes.
Exactly. There's this amazing anecdote from when Bhikkhu Anālayo and Dhammaruwan, who was an adult by this time, were chanting the Satipatthana Sutta together. They reached a highly specific line about bodily awareness that translates to stretching and bending the arm. And Dhammaruwan just started giggling.
which seems completely out of place. I mean, you are chanting a serious, foundational, meditative text about observing the body, and suddenly he's laughing like a school kid.
Right. But reportedly, he felt this sudden urge to laugh because he remembered a piece of tacit monastic humor firmly attached to that specific line.
It's so human.
It really is. Apparently, there's an obscure joke in the ancient commentarial tradition about a monk who was listening to a teaching. And when the teacher mentions stretching and bending his arm, the monk physically does it and accidentally touches a nun, and a whole humorous, awkward situation ensues.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Dhammaruwan didn't know the joke in his current life. He just felt the humor welling up attached to the phrase. It is literally like knowing an inside joke from a 1,500-year-old workplace.
It's a wonderful detail. That tacit emotional memory attached to the intellectual recall is just remarkable. But this deep structural memory of text and context actually forces us to confront a major puzzle about how ancient people memorized.
Right.
Why were Brahmin boys, and later these early Buddhist reciters, trained to memorize vast, complex texts long before they were old enough to understand what the philosophy actually meant?
It seems completely backward to how we operate today, doesn't it? I mean, if I want you to remember a complex theory, I explain the underlying logic to you first, so you understand the concept.
Yeah.
Once you understand the why, you remember the what.
Modern people absolutely assume understanding must come first. But the ancient oral traditions understood something profoundly counterintuitive. Understanding can actually corrupt perfect recall.
Wow.
And modern psychology heavily supports this ancient wisdom. If you look at the foundational work of Frederick Bartlett on reconstructive memory, or Elizabeth Loftus on the misinformation effect, the data is unequivocal. Our brains do not work like video cameras.
Right. Every time you access a memory, you aren't playing back a static file. You are literally reassembling the pieces.
Exactly. We rewrite our memories based on our current beliefs, our assumptions, and our linguistic understanding of the world. So if an ancient reciter tried to philosophically understand the sutta while simultaneously memorizing it, they might inadvertently paraphrase it. They might substitute a synonym that makes more sense to them personally. And suddenly, over 3 generations, the exact teaching is permanently altered.
Bhikkhu Anālayo actually cited a brilliant modern study involving a Microsoft Word instruction manual that perfectly grounds this mechanism.
Oh, yes, I love this study.
It's so good. Researchers gave a technical manual to 3 groups: absolute beginners, people with some software knowledge, and advanced experts. And they asked them to memorize it. The absolute beginners actually remembered the exact phrasing and syntax of the manual significantly better than the experts.
Which sounds crazy at first.
Right. But because the experts understood the concepts, their brains got lazy. They just paraphrased the text based on what they already knew to be true about software.
The beginners had no existing conceptual framework to fall back on, so they had to memorize the literal phonetic sequence of the words. The sound and the structure were literally all they had to grip onto.
It's exactly like saving a file on your computer as a raw image versus letting an AI try to enhance it.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, the raw file keeps the exact pixels no matter what. It doesn't know what the picture is of. It just holds the data. But the AI tries to understand the image, and in doing so, it smooths out edges, alters colors, and subtly changes the reality to fit its predictive model. The ancient oral tradition was explicitly designed to save raw files.
That is a brilliant analogy. By protecting the phonetic sound patterns long before allowing the intellect to interpret the meaning, the ancient world preserved the exact teachings across immense stretches of time. And we really have to look closely at the specific teaching Dhammaruwan was chanting, because it happens to be one of the most critical texts in all of human history.
He was chanting the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. And since you listening know that's the absolute foundational bedrock of the path, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma at Deer Park, the fact that this specific text survived intact is mind-blowing.
Absolutely.
It's the discourse that lays out the middle way in the Four Noble Truths.
Yes. It is the architectural blueprint for the entire Buddhist tradition. But this raises an important question, because relying on human memory across thousands of years always invites skepticism.
Naturally.
How do we scientifically know that this raw file wasn't corrupted over centuries of oral transmission before it was finally written down?
Because we have a control group. And that's where the cross-cultural textual evidence comes in. Anālayo's research specifically highlights the Chinese Sayukta Agama parallel, which scholars refer to as Psi 379.
Let's define what that is for a moment. An Agama is essentially the early collection of discourses, completely parallel to the Pāli texts we've been discussing, but preserved by different early Buddhist schools.
Right.
Imagine an oral text traveling south from India down into Sri Lanka, and a completely separate branch of monks carrying that exact same text thousands of miles along the Silk Road into China, where it is eventually translated into a completely different linguistic structure.
Two completely isolated lineages.
Correct. And when modern scholars place the Pāli version preserved in Sri Lanka next to the Chinese Sa 379 version preserved in East Asia, they find that these divergent lineages preserve the exact same core structure of the teaching. The middle way, the Four Noble Truths, the setting at Deer Park, the vital architecture is perfectly intact.
So on one hand, we have the ancient Chinese text providing rigorous academic proof of preservation across a massive geographical divide. And on the other hand, we have this living, breathing story of a 2-year-old child's voice carrying the exact same phonetic teaching.
It's beautiful.
They are two entirely different witnesses pointing to the incredible devotion taken to carry the Dharma across time.
The historical continuity is awe-inspiring, but, we promised at the beginning of our deep dive that we wouldn't just leave this as a neat historical curiosity. The story of a child chanting in Sri Lanka has to apply to your morning commute, or how you handle stress, or your daily meditation practice.
Right. So what does this actually mean for you, the listener?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it requires us to pivot our focus entirely to our own nervous systems. In early Buddhism, rebirth isn't just an isolated metaphysical claim about what happens after death. It's part of a much larger, observable minute-to-minute vision of cause and effect.
Intentions matter.
Exactly. Actions leave traces. We absolutely don't need to use Dhammaruwan's story to definitively prove rebirth to anyone. Instead, we can use it to reflect deeply on the staggering neurobiological power of habit.
Because the uncomfortable truth is, we are all reciters.
We really are.
Every single day, you are silently reciting something. You're constantly rehearsing old, familiar stories about who you are, what you can't do, or who has wronged you. You are chanting your anxieties.
Yeah.
You might not be chanting ancient Pāli suttas, but you are absolutely engaged in a daily, rigorous practice of internal recitation.
And modern neuroscience backs up this ancient insight completely. We talk about neuroplasticity, the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. When you run a worry loop through your default mode network over and over, you are literally carving a deeper groove into your brain.
You are training yourself to be an expert in anxiety.
Right, just like a baka trained to be an expert in the suttas. Buddhist practice is essentially an invitation to introduce a deliberate alternative repetition into your life.
Meditation is an interrupt mechanism.
Precisely. When you sit in meditation and repeatedly return your attention to the breath, you are practicing a new recitation. When you actively cultivate kindness or bring mindful awareness to a moment of sharp frustration instead of just reacting blindly, you are shaping your memory and your neural architecture at the deepest possible level.
What we repeat becomes familiar. And what becomes familiar eventually becomes entirely natural to us. The Dharma isn't just a philosophy we read about and conceptually agree with. It is a living current.
It's something we embody.
Just as the ancient reciters trained their bodies to hold the words, we are training our minds to hold awareness.
That is the essence of why we practice. You are building a mental library, one repetition at a time.
It completely changes how you view a simple daily habit. And it leaves me with this final thought. If the ancient world used raw, rote memory to preserve profound truths, carving wisdom directly into their neural pathways, it makes you wonder what our modern reliance on outsourcing our memory to smartphones and search engines is doing to our internal architecture.
That is a really challenging question.
Right. If we never force ourselves to hold anything in our minds, are we losing the biological ability to truly internalize wisdom? To close today's episode, we will now end with chanting. May these ancient sounds support mindfulness, peace, and awakening in daily life.
Pindita Sutta Arami